Horror doesn't need monsters. It doesn't need jump scares. It doesn't even need blood. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing in a game is watching a world die slowly, quietly, inevitably, and being forced to wade through its decay. Woodfall Temple isn't just Majora's Mask's first dungeon, it's a masterclass in atmospheric dread that shows Nintendo understood horror better than most horror games ever will. While other games scream at players, Woodfall whispers, and that whisper, it's absolutely chilling. Welcome to an exploration of why this poisoned swamp temple represents gaming's most sophisticated approach to environmental horror, a place where every step forward feels like sinking deeper into something fundamentally wrong with the world. Before Link even reaches Woodfall Temple, Majora's Mask has already established something vital. Termina is sick. Not monster-infested, not demon-cursed, sick. The southern swamp isn't being attacked, it's dying, and that distinction makes all the difference. The moment players exit Clocktown and arrive at the swamp, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. The music becomes muted, almost mournful. The water that should be clear and life-giving has turned a murky, sickly brown. The vegetation along the shoreline droops and withers. Deku scrubs speak in hushed, worried tones about the waters becoming poisoned. This isn't adventure. This is arriving at a crime scene. The visual design reinforces this decay at every turn. Termina Field features bright greens and vibrant blues. The swamp, muddy browns, diseased yellows, and that awful grayish tint to everything organic. The color palette alone communicates illness before a single word of dialogue explains what's happening. Players feel the wrongness immediately. And then there's the Witch's Boat Tour. This seemingly helpful navigation mechanic becomes something far more sinister when examined closely. The boat glides through poisoned water, past dead trees, under twisted branches. The witch herself seems unbothered by the corruption surrounding her, as if she's become numb to the decay. The tour isn't showing players the swamp's beauty, it's a guided tour through an ecosystem's death throes. The Deku Palace adds another layer of creeping dread. The king has gone mad with grief and paranoia, convinced the monkey stole his daughter. The guards enforce brutal punishment without question. The entire society has become infected with fear and suspicion, not from external attack, but from the slow realization that their world is ending and nobody knows how to stop it. This isn't monster invasion horror, this is societal collapse horror. But here's where Majora's Mask's horror becomes truly sophisticated. The game never tells players that Woodfall Temple is the source of the poison. The Deku King blames the monkeys. Other characters talk vaguely about bad water. There's no convenient exposition dump explaining that an evil presence in the temple caused everything. Players must piece it together themselves, and that ambiguity, that uncertainty about what's actually happening, makes everything more unsettling. When Link finally enters Woodfall Temple, the horror doesn't escalate, it deepens. The temple feels quiet, too quiet. There are enemies, yes, but they're scattered, almost lethargic. The Deku Babas barely react to Link's presence. The Skulltulas seem to move through thick air. Everything in this temple has been slowed down, drained, infected by the same sickness plaguing the swamp outside. Listen carefully during gameplay and other sounds emerge. The wet, organic gurgling of toxic water moving through ancient channels. The occasional creak of wood settling, or is it rotting? The faint whistle of air moving through passages that shouldn't be empty, but are. These aren't soundtrack elements designed to scare. They're environmental details that create mounting unease through sheer authenticity. The architecture tells its own disturbing story. Woodfall Temple isn't a dungeon built for combat or defense, it's a structure that once served a purpose, possibly religious, possibly practical, that has been corrupted into something else entirely. The decorative elements throughout the temple suggest it was once a place of importance, maybe even beauty. Now, however, those same decorations feel like monuments in a mausoleum, honoring something that no longer exists. The central chamber embodies this corruption perfectly. A massive pillar rises and falls through poisoned water, its gears and mechanisms still functioning despite the decay surrounding them. This isn't a broken mechanism, it's a working mechanism in a dying body. The temple still breathes, still moves, still operates, but it's sick. Watching that pillar rise and fall feels like watching a diseased heart continue beating, unaware that everything around it is rotting. Now let's discuss the gameplay mechanics and how they reinforce this horror. Link enters Woodfall Temple as a Deku scrub, the most vulnerable form in the entire game. Deku Link can't use most weapons, can't swim in deep water, can't take many hits before dying. The player is stripped of power and agency, forced to confront environmental decay while fundamentally weakened. This design choice isn't accidental, it's brilliant horror psychology. Traditional action games empower players, giving them bigger weapons and stronger abilities to match escalating threats. Majora's Mask does the opposite. It makes players small, weak, and fragile, then drops them into an environment defined by toxicity and decay. The horror comes from helplessness, from being forced to navigate corruption without the tools to combat it effectively. The torchlighting puzzles take on new meaning in this context. Typically, lighting torches in Zelda dungeons is a straightforward mechanic. In Woodfall Temple, it becomes an act of desperate resistance. Each torch lit pushes back the darkness slightly, creates a small island of warmth in the cold decay. But the darkness always remains, pressing in from all sides, reminding players that their light is temporary and insufficient. The water level manipulation mechanic forces even more uncomfortable interaction with the temple's sickness. Players must raise and lower poisoned water repeatedly, watching it flood chambers, submerge platforms, fill corridors with toxic liquid. There's no way to purify this water, no way to avoid touching it. The only option is to control it, manipulate it, use the temple's own corruption as a tool for progression. Players become complicit in the decay, using it rather than cleansing it. And here's the psychological horror. It works. Players succeed by embracing the temple's corrupted systems rather than fighting them. Want to reach that platform? Let the poison water rise. Need to access a lower area? Drop the water level and wade through the contaminated pool at the bottom. The temple teaches players that surviving its horror requires accepting its rules, working within its diseased logic. The enemy encounters reinforce this oppression. The dragonflies aren't aggressive predators, they're persistent annoyances that wear players down through attrition. The Deku Babas emerge from murky water, making every pool a potential threat. The snappers lumber slowly but relentlessly, creating constant pressure without overt aggression. These enemies don't attack, they drain, they exhaust, they embody the temple's slow, inevitable consumption of everything within it. The mini-boss fight against the Gecko and Snapper combination exemplifies this design philosophy. The Gecko itself is small, almost pathetic looking, but it commands a much larger Snapper, using the corrupted creature as both weapon and shield. The fight isn't about defeating a powerful monster, it's about separating parasite from host, exposing the thing controlling the corruption before it can be destroyed. The horror isn't in the combat difficulty, but in what the combat represents, the temple's ability to corrupt and control even its own inhabitants. But the most unsettling element of Woodfall Temple isn't any specific encounter or puzzle, it's the implication. The temple never explains what caused the corruption. There's no evil wizard casting poison spells, no demon lord actively destroying the swamp. The corruption simply exists. It's ambient, it's environmental, it's a sickness without a source that can be confronted directly. Odalwa, the temple's boss, should provide answers. Instead, he deepens the mystery. This masked warrior doesn't appear to be the source of the poison. He doesn't use toxic attacks. His connection to the swamp's corruption remains unclear. He seems less like the architect of the temple's sickness and more like another victim, a powerful entity trapped within the decay, perhaps even sustained by it. The boss arena itself is strangely sterile compared to the rest of the temple, a flat, circular platform with pillars around the edges, no poisoned water, no visual indication of corruption. It's as if Odalwa exists in a pocket dimension, separated from the very sickness he supposedly causes. His defeat cures the swamp, but the mechanism of that cure remains unexplained. Did killing Odolwa remove the source, or did his death simply break whatever maintained the corruption? This ambiguity is intentional and devastating. Horror thrives on the unknown, on questions without satisfying answers. Woodfall Temple never provides closure about its corruption's origin.
Was it Skull Kid's curse? A natural disease amplified by dark magic? Something older, predating Majora's arrival in Termina? The game doesn't say, and that silence echoes far longer than any exposition could. The aftermath of defeating Odolwa provides no relief. Yes, the water clears. Yes, the Deku princess is rescued. But something about the southern swamp still feels wrong. The trees remain twisted. The atmosphere stays muted. It's as if the corruption ran so deep that its removal couldn't fully heal what it damaged. The swamp survives, but it's scarred, changed, forever marked by what it endured. This lingering unease separates Woodfall Temple from typical video game dungeons. Most games provide cathartic victory after defeating a boss. Music swells triumphantly, NPCs celebrate, the world visibly improves. Woodfall offers muted recovery instead. The crisis is averted, not solved. The symptoms are treated, not the disease. Players save the swamp, but they can't unpoison it. They can't restore what was lost. They can only prevent further loss. The game reinforces this through its 3-day cycle mechanic. Every time the cycle resets, the southern swamp returns to its poisoned state. Link must watch the corruption return, knowing exactly what's happening, understanding that without intervention, the swamp will die again. The horror becomes cyclical, repetitive, inevitable without constant vigilance. This isn't a problem that can be permanently solved. It's a condition that must be perpetually managed. Now, let's examine how Woodfall Temple challenges conventional video game horror. Traditional horror games rely heavily on visceral fear, monsters jumping from shadows, gore covering walls, sudden loud noises shocking players. These tactics produce immediate reactions, but often lack lasting impact. The fear dissipates quickly once the shock wears off. Woodfall Temple employs existential horror instead. The fear doesn't come from what might jump out. It comes from being surrounded by decay, from moving through an environment fundamentally hostile to life, from the knowledge that this corruption spreads slowly but inexorably if left unchecked. This type of horror settles into the psyche, creating discomfort that persists long after the controller is set down. The temple's horror is also deeply environmental, which makes it more relevant now than ever. In 2000, environmental themes in gaming were relatively uncommon. In 2026, they resonate powerfully. Woodfall Temple presents an ecosystem in collapse, poisoned by forces beyond individual control, dying despite the good intentions of its inhabitants. The parallels to real-world environmental crises are impossible to ignore. But the game never preaches, never lectures. It simply shows. The poisoned water speaks for itself. The wilting vegetation needs no explanation. The panic in the Deku scrub's voices communicates the urgency without heavy-handed dialogue. Majora's Mask trusts players to understand the horror through experience rather than exposition, and that trust creates immersive dread. The Deku scrub transformation adds another layer to this environmental horror. Link doesn't just observe the dying swamp, he becomes part of it. As a Deku scrub, Link belongs to the ecosystem being destroyed. The poison isn't just an obstacle, it's poison killing Link's own people, his own home if he remains in that form. The player character has immediate personal stakes in the corruption's outcome, beyond generic heroism. This creates fascinating narrative tension. Link isn't native to Termina. He's an outsider who stumbled into this dying world, but through transformation, he temporarily becomes part of what he's trying to save. The game asks uncomfortable questions through this mechanic. Does Link have the right to intervene in Termina's fate? Is he saving this world or just delaying its inevitable collapse?
Can an outsider truly understand the depth of loss Termina faces? The game never answers these questions. It simply raises them through environmental storytelling and mechanical design. The poisoned swamp becomes a moral dilemma disguised as a dungeon. Every step forward asks whether salvation is possible, or if Link is just applying bandages to mortal wounds. The game's broader context amplifies Woodfall's horror. This is the first region Link attempts to save, the introduction to Termina's problems. If this is how bad things are at the beginning, what horrors await in later regions? The answer, of course, is escalating dread. But Woodfall establishes the template. Termina doesn't suffer from dramatic invasions or epic battles. It suffers from quiet, pervasive decay that consumes everything. The Southern Swamp's corruption also establishes Majora's Mask's core theme, inevitability. The moon will fall in 3 days, that's certain. The swamp will die without intervention, also certain. Every region faces its own doom, counting down to catastrophe. Woodfall Temple teaches players that in Termina, horror isn't about if disaster strikes, it's about when, and whether Link can delay it long enough to find a permanent solution.
This temporal horror creates constant psychological pressure. Even as players navigate Woodfall Temple, the clock ticks. Hours pass, the moon draws closer, the swamp continues dying. There's never enough time to fully process what's happening because the next crisis always looms. The game forces players to triage disasters, saving what can be saved while accepting that some losses are inevitable. The architectural design supports this temporal dread. Woodfall Temple feels ancient, like it stood for centuries or millennia, yet it's dying now, in these specific 3 days. What kept this structure stable for generations? Why is it collapsing at this exact moment? The implication is terrifying. Majora's arrival broke something fundamental in Termina, disrupting systems that had maintained equilibrium for ages. The decorative masks throughout the temple take on sinister significance in this context. Majora's Mask is fundamentally about masks, transformation, identity, hidden faces. Woodfall Temple's architecture includes numerous mask motifs carved into walls and pillars. Are these decorative, religious, or do they represent something darker, physical manifestations of Majora's influence slowly consuming the temple from within? The game never confirms this interpretation, but the visual language supports it. The masks aren't welcoming or benevolent, they're twisted, alien, watching. Their presence suggests that Majora's corruption isn't just environmental, it's architectural, spiritual, woven into the physical structure of Termina itself. Killing Odalwa treats symptoms, but the disease runs much deeper. Let's discuss pacing and how it enhances horror. Woodfall Temple isn't large compared to later dungeons. Players can complete it in under an hour with practice, but that brevity serves the horror perfectly. The temple doesn't overstay its welcome, doesn't exhaust its atmosphere through extended exposure. It delivers concentrated dread, then releases players back into the swamp before desensitization sets in. This restraint demonstrates sophisticated horror design. The temptation in horror game development is to maximize scares, to pack every moment with threat and tension. But constant intensity breeds numbness. Woodfall Temple understands that horror needs breathing room, that the spaces between threats allow previous encounters to resonate and multiply in players' imaginations. The temple also benefits from being experienced early in the game, before players fully understand Majora's Mask's mechanics and rhythms. There's genuine uncertainty in that first playthrough. Can Link die permanently? Will time run out? Is this corruption reversible? That uncertainty amplifies every tense moment, every encounter with poisoned water, every step deeper into the temple's heart. Veteran players experience different horror on return visits. They know the swamp can be saved. They understand the mechanics, but that knowledge doesn't reduce the dread, it transforms it.
Now players experience the horror of watching disaster unfold when they know it could be prevented, when they understand exactly what will happen if they don't intervene. It's the horror of bearing witness to preventable catastrophe. The game's time loop structure means players often watch the southern swamp die multiple times throughout a playthrough. Each cycle, the poison returns, the Deku King's madness resets, the monkey faces execution again. The ecosystem begins its collapse anew. This repetition doesn't diminish impact, it compounds it. Each cycle reinforces how fragile Termina's stability is, how constant vigilance is required to maintain even temporary salvation. Woodfall Temple ultimately achieves something remarkable in gaming. It makes environmental decay genuinely horrifying without relying on shock tactics or overt monsters. The horror emerges organically from atmosphere, sound design, visual storytelling, and mechanical design working in harmony. Every element supports the central theme of creeping, inevitable corruption. The Temple proves that video game horror can be sophisticated, subtle, and devastating. It doesn't need to make players jump, it makes them uncomfortable. It doesn't need to shock, it unsettles. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And somehow that whisper echoes far longer than any scream could. Consider the lasting impact. Players remember Woodfall Temple not for specific scares, but how it felt. That oppressive atmosphere, that sense of moving through something fundamentally wrong, that helplessness watching corruption spread. These impressions persist years after playthrough, coloring memories of the entire game. Woodfall establishes Majora's Mask's emotional tone immediately and indelibly. The temple also redefines what Zelda dungeons can be. Previous entries featured challenges, puzzles, enemies to defeat. Woodfall adds a psychological dimension. It's not just a place to conquer, it's an experience to endure. A space that tests players' resilience against mounting dread as much as their puzzle-solving skills. It expands Zelda's vocabulary, proving the series can deliver genuine horror within its adventure framework. Modern game design increasingly recognizes environmental storytelling's power, but Majora's Mask mastered this technique over 2 decades ago. Woodfall Temple tells complete narratives through architecture, color palette, sound design, and mechanical design without lengthy cutscenes or explicit dialogue. Players piece together the swamp's tragedy through observation and experience, active participation rather than passive reception. This approach respects player intelligence while delivering deeper immersion. The game trusts that showing poisoned water, wilting plants, and panicked NPCs communicates crisis more effectively than exposition could. It allows players to feel smart for understanding context, to experience discovery rather than mere information delivery. That trust creates investment that scripted storytelling often struggles to match. The horror also benefits from Majora's Mask's broader narrative restraint. The game never fully explains Skull Kid's motivations, Majora's true nature, or Termina's relationship to Hyrule. This ambiguity means Woodfall Temple's corruption exists within a larger mystery. Is this localized disaster or symptom of cosmic catastrophe? The game provides clues, suggestions, implications, but never definitive answers. That uncertainty magnifies every encounter with decay. Woodfall Temple represents gaming's potential for sophisticated horror storytelling. It demonstrates that terror doesn't require excessive violence, jump scares, or graphic imagery. Sometimes the most frightening thing is simply watching a world die quietly, inevitably, while being just powerful enough to delay but not prevent its demise. That existential dread, understanding that all efforts only buy time against inevitable collapse, cuts deeper than any monster could. The temple's lasting legacy extends beyond Majora's Mask. Subsequent games have attempted similar environmental horror, but few match Woodfall's concentrated effectiveness. Its approach influenced how designers think about atmosphere, about using restraint and implication rather than excess. The Temple proved that Nintendo, a company known for family-friendly content, could deliver genuine, lingering horror without compromising its core values. As players emerge from Woodfall Temple having defeated Odolwa and restored the swamp, relief should dominate. Mission accomplished, region saved. But that's not what most players feel. Instead, there's awareness that 3 more regions face similar fates, that the moon still falls, that Terminus problems run far deeper than poisoned water. Woodfall Temple doesn't provide closure, it reveals the scope of challenges ahead. This opening dungeon serves as Majora's Mask's thesis statement. In Termina, horror is ambient, pervasive, and deeply personal. It's watching ecosystems collapse. It's witnessing societies break under pressure. It's confronting mortality on environmental, social, and cosmic scales simultaneously. And it all begins in a quiet temple in a dying swamp, where the only sound is poisoned water dripping steadily onto ancient stone. Woodfall Temple doesn't need to be the scariest location in gaming. It just needs to be deeply, persistently, unforgettably unsettling. And on that measure, it succeeds absolutely. This poisoned swamp dungeon remains one of gaming's most sophisticated horror experiences, precisely because it understands that true dread doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It seeps in slowly, quietly, inevitably, like poison spreading through clear water until everything has been corrupted. That's the genius of Woodfall Temple. That's why its subtlety remains Majora's Mask's greatest horror, not despite its quietness, but because of it.